Well, then, we are up to Tampa Bay. I'm going to talk about my favorite members of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I got that logo, which is the middle logo between the first one and the one they wear now. It's kind of like the transitional logo to this one. So I figured, yeah, what the heck. I've worn both recently, so why not? And so we're going to talk about my 15 favorite members of the Lightning, which is tricky in that there's a lot of players who've gone through that have been pretty darn good. Honorable mention to Vinny Prospal. Just gonna say straight out, honorable mention to Vinny Prospal. Be people at the end of this that just fast forward to the end and go, "Where's Vinny Prospal?" He's an honorable mention. So number 15 on this list. Tim Taylor. Absolute shame that Tim Taylor didn't stick around with Detroit, but he ends up in Tampa, and he was a good, hardworking forward. There's not a whole lot else to say other than Taylor was a good, hardworking forward. Uh, I, I don't have a whole lot else to say other than he was your prototypical bottom six penalty killer and very good at the job he did for the Tampa Bay Lightning. This was a hardworking bunch, which brings me to 14, another hard worker who I think deserves mention on the list, and that's Rob Zamner. One thing that an expansion team can do is it can take a player who might be a cast off from one organization and make him just better. And it makes you wonder why other teams didn't see whatever that expansion team did, and whether it's, well, that team had more depth or that team just didn't have a need for that player. We've seen it in Vegas very recently, but we saw it with guys like Zamner and Taylor years and years ago when the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I talked about it in videos yesterday where their history has been checkered with some pretty bad franchise choices and some pretty bad decisions. But those were two good decisions. Those two were two good additions that worked out pretty darn well. Number 13 on the list. 13, I will put I know Pavel Kubina. I know people went after him for his defensive coverage towards the end of his time in Tampa. I always thought he took more blame than he needed to, and then he ends up in Toronto, and of course that just makes it worse. But Kubina, I thought in his prime was pretty good, and good offensively minded defenseman for the Tampa Bay Lightning. I want to, you know what? I'm going to throw an honorable mention out to Roman Hamrlik, who I understand is the number one draft pick, didn't end up remaining with Tampa for very long. But I didn't think he was that bad either. I thought sometimes he took a lot of flack because he was a number one draft pick. I think there's that pressure. I think Aaron Ekblad in Florida is an example of that as well, where it's like he's not a bad defenseman. He's a good defenseman. It's just when people look and they go number one overall, that's where people get thrown off. So, yeah, I want to throw an honorable mention out there to Roman Hamrlik because I thought he was a decent enough defenseman. I don't think I've done a video on Hamrlik, and I should because his career was an interesting one. Number 12. All right, at 12. On my favorites. So I mentioned with expansion teams, the players being revealed as being better. Darren Peau we already knew was pretty good when he left Buffalo. Darren Peau had that 1 year in Buffalo. It was absolutely spectacular. And then he went to Tampa Bay, and he was pretty good again. So Darren Peau was the guy holding the net together for Tampa Bay during their early years of existence. And I liked him. I did. I thought he was a decent goaltender. And then it just kind of fell apart. Like I mentioned in the video yesterday regarding their miserable season, he had back problems. And yeah, when you're a goaltender, if your mobility, your ability to move side to side goes, your career in the NHL probably is pretty near done. Unless you find a way to completely revamp your mechanics in the net, it's probably done. So, Darren Peau, career that could have been longer, but still one of my favorites. So he's in the list. Number 11. Dan Boyle. So when the Tampa Bay Lightning win the Stanley Cup in 2004, Dan Boyle's role was significant, and he had an up and down career, and there were certainly criticisms of his defense as well. But Dan Boyle, good power play defenseman as well, and he spent about 5 years in Tampa, and then he had the 5 years in San Jose. I've thought about doing a career video on him as well, so we'll see. But Dan Boyle, one of the one of my favorites when he was there. Again, when a defenseman's a little bit suspect defensively, at times it can really stand out. I think of what PK Subban deals with right now, and I've seen that all the way through a defenseman's career. And in some cases it can be justified. But you look at a guy like, for instance, Larry Murphy in Toronto, where he had his deficiencies and goes to Detroit, and Detroit goes, hey, we can fix those and we can make things better. And they did, and they won a Stanley Cup. Or sometimes it gets completely overblown as well. Number 10. Brayden Point. When Brayden Point got called up a few years ago, and I thought he was absolutely fantastic, there were some who said, well, he looks good because he doesn't have any pressure, and because he's getting ice time, he's not going to get when you've got Stamkos in the lineup. He's not going to get when the team's healthy. They all, I think they had their top three centers were all hurt at the same time. I'm trying to remember. It was crazy. Tampa Bay went through this just rash of injuries. And so Point was in a pretty productive role and pretty prominent role, and he kept it. He's kept it since then, and he's been kind of sort of fantastic for the most part. Now, I know this year wasn't necessarily that step to that next level for him, but he's still pretty darn good. And so I cheer for him, absolutely. Number 9 on the list. Yep, I'm going to put this guy at 9. This is when people get all upset with me. Vinny Lecavalier. First off, when he came into the league, it took him a while to get to that next level, and then he gets to that next level, and he was absolutely fantastic. Again, that 2004 Stanley Cup run, there were some really big stories out of that. But Lecavalier was never a guy that was necessarily my favorite player on the team, so that's why he's going to occupy the number 9 spot on this list. Again, it's not a measure of the all-time greats when I'm talking about my favorite players. So this is where that disconnect comes in, where people are like, well, this guy should be number 1 on your favorites because he's the best. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're my favorite. My favorite movies aren't necessarily the best movies. My favorite bands aren't necessarily the best, most technically, sound bands. Listen to a band and go, yeah, it's pretty good, but they're not that Royal Philharmonic. That's pretty good. This is just, that's just that. To me, that's the measure right there. So Vinny Lecavalier at 9. I really shouldn't be apologizing for who my favorite players are, but I feel like that's sometimes what I have to do. Weird. It's very, very strange. I find it very strange. I've mentioned before, but it is weird. Number 8 on a list of my favorites. I'll put this guy at 8. Now, Nikita Kucherov would be higher on the list, but there have been some controversial incidents, one of which got him suspended in the playoffs. That's knocked him down. But the reason that Kucherov's still on my list is this. At every point, he was underestimated. At every point, it felt like he felt like he was drafted too late. It felt like he was an afterthought as a prospect when he was doing pretty well before getting into the NHL. When he reached the NHL, again, it felt like he was underrated and undervalued. And he ends up getting 128 points last year as like the pinnacle. That's probably going to be the most points he scores in his career in any given season. And even this season, he was on pace for about 100 points. So there's something to be said for the guy that isn't the number 1 draft pick, that isn't seen as the number 1 prospect at points in time. But absolutely, he's been a beast the whole way through. And again, I know the emotions get the better of him, and it causes some rather questionable actions on his part, which is why he's not higher on the list. Otherwise, he might have been number 1. He might have been number 1. Number 7. Yeah, number 7. It's Steven Stamkos. Now, a lot is said about Stamkos and Game 7s and how he hasn't produced in Game 7s. And Stamkos is going to face these questions throughout his career until they win a Stanley Cup, because other players have gone through this as well. But Stamkos is a very gifted performer who, through injury, has changed the way he shoots, has changed his game, and he has still managed to be one of the premier forwards in the NHL. When he had a chance to maybe make some more money somewhere else, he chose to stay in Tampa. He wanted to win, and he felt his best chance to do that was in Tampa. And he seems to be a loyal player who really enjoys playing for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I have very little doubt that at the time he retires from Tampa, he'll be seen as probably their all-time greatest player. I don't think you'd get that consensus right now, but I think by the time he retires, that's probably where he'll be. Number 6. Brad Richards. And again, there's going to be people who look at my top 10 and say, wait, why in that order? Richards, again, I liked Richards more than Lecavalier at the time those guys were playing together. And Richards was a huge part of that 2004 Stanley Cup as well. And he was a player that he wasn't a number 1 draft pick either. And he fought his way through. And he proved that he probably should have been a much higher drafted player than what he was. I like Richards quite a bit. I think he's got... he had tremendous talent. He would then move around the league a little bit after he left Tampa, but for me, he's a Bolt, even though he did play in Dallas for a while there. But to me, he's a Tampa Bay Lightning member. When I think about which team I remember him most with, it'd be Tampa. And really good, solid Canadian kid. Number 5. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, I'll put this guy at 5. So why Alex Killoran? Alex Killoran this year hit an absolute peak goal-wise that I don't think we saw coming. But the thing with Killoran is effort. Every single game, every single shift, it's that effort. His hard work is fantastic. And again, this is one of those players that in having this channel and watching every game and watching every team, I've really, really, really been impressed by Alex Killoran. He has been absolutely fantastic, and so I have no qualms with putting Killoran in my top 5. And again, it's that hard work, that underdog, and his contract is pretty pricey considering where his production was coming into this year, and he may end up being moved because of his contract at some point. I would be very happy with him in Boston. I'd be happy with him in Dallas. He'd be actually a pretty good fit for Dallas. They need some more goals. He's still a hard worker, pretty good defensively. That'll work out okay. I'd be totally fine with that. I also want to throw in an honorable mention to Tyler Johnson that didn't make the list, but Johnson could have made the list if I'd gone to, say, 20. And JT Miller would have probably made the list if not for the fact that he didn't play that long in Tampa. So that's why JT Miller's not on the list. And as a Canuck fan, it might be a little bit of bias that would put JT Miller in the list now, so I'm not going to do that. Number 4. That's 1, 13. Yeah, okay. This is where he's going to go. Yes, the Bulin wall. Nikolai Habibulin was another one of those goalies who was pretty good behind bad teams. And then in Tampa, he was pretty good behind a good team. And he got himself a Stanley Cup in 2004. And whether it was his name, whether it was his style of play, whatever it was, Nikolai Habibulin was a lot of fun to watch. And there are obviously things that have happened way after being in Tampa that you can look at his bad contract and some off-ice stuff as well. But when he was in Tampa, he was fantastic. And yeah, I mean, Tampa, one question mark they had along the way as well is Habibulin going to be good enough? And then he answered that in 2004. So that was good on him as well. Number 3. Now, at the time that the Vancouver Canucks moved on from Brian Bradley, I thought they were crazy. And people thought I was crazy for thinking they were crazy. And then he goes to Tampa and he produces a ton of points. They sat Brian Burke down on Vancouver radio and they asked him, so Bradley, with 86 points in Tampa, does that make you guys regret you let him go? And his answer was no, because he was in Vancouver, he wouldn't be getting as much ice time as he's getting in Tampa, which led to me being very, very angry. Because he had 86 points. 86 points. I don't care about... If you're going to say, well, in Vancouver, if he had that much ice time, he would have scored less than 86. No. He still would have... Anyways, he was very underrated, is my point with Brian Bradley. I thought he was a steal for the Canucks when they got him. I didn't understand why they just let him go. And then he ends up in Tampa, and he was excellent for them. You need that star player up front. And he was not a superstar, but he was a very good player who scored, point a game a couple of times in Tampa, as I remember it. And yet, I thought underrated throughout his career as well. So, Brian Bradley, I have it number 3, and unapologetically as well. Because I do respect those guys who are willing to go to that expansion team, not complain, and play really, really well. And Bradley was all of those things. Number 2, nobody should be surprised at number 2. So last summer, I did a video where I talked about the top 20 defensemen in the NHL, and I had Victor Hedman at number 1 on my list of who I thought were the best defensemen in the NHL, and I had Roman Josi at number 2. I still believe those are the 2 absolute best defensemen in the National Hockey League. Hedman, the problem is, of course, he's got to stay healthy that full season, but and the other thing is, if he ever figures out a way to harness for a full 82 games, the way that he consistently plays after the All-Star break, I think it's undeniable that he would be the best defenseman in the NHL. We can start comparing him at that point to guys like Lidstrom and Bork. We can compare him to Lidstrom and Bork and guys like that. And really, Hedman is fantastic, and he is one of the most dynamic defensemen at both ends of the rink, and absolute wow factor. I remember during his second year when he was struggling, and then he signs a big extension with Tampa, and I thought, that's kind of risky. I don't know. He hasn't looked that great this year, and then he was worth every cent of it. So Victor Hedman, pretty excellent defenseman, which puts it number 1. Nobody should be surprised because he meets every criteria for what I like in a player. Marty St Louie is the number 1 point producer for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Marty St Louie played for Calgary, and Calgary never really gave him that opportunity. So much like Brian Bradley in Vancouver and Calgary, he was in Calgary too. Marty St Louie in Calgary was never really given that opportunity to excel, and he gets to Tampa and he takes advantage of it. Marty St Louie, 953 points as a Tampa Bay Lightning member, and he worked his ass off for every single point. He was smaller, so he had to work harder than the guys who had the physical benefit of being bigger and taller. And so his work ethic had to be at that next level in order to meet the level of the other players on the ice. And he always exceeded expectations, and he did it over and over and over. And smaller player, yes, very talented, heart and soul guy. And in 2004, I couldn't have been happier for anybody than I was for Marty St Louie. That he proved that anybody who had been complaining about his size and saying he wasn't, big enough for the NHL, they were all wrong. And so he's one of those guys I look at when I hear somebody complaining about another player. Oh, that guy's too small for the NHL, and I will think of Marty St Louie and how, he proved everybody wrong. So he is my favorite member of the Tampa Bay Lightning because, not a number 1 draft pick, not a guy who was seen as a superstar player when he gets to Tampa, and he just, year by year, he whittled away at it and got more and more trust and more opportunity, and he took advantage of it every step of the way. So there you go. My 15 favorite Bolts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And remember, stay home, stay safe as much as you can. Remember to keep your hands nice and clean. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.